Good morning. Charles Darwin was born on February 12th, 1809, and since his 215th birthday is tomorrow, and since the product of his research greatly influenced the development of the humanist tradition, which is so prevalent in Unitarian Universalism today, I thought this might be a good time to spend some time with him and his life and his work and his legacy. His theory of natural selection as the means of evolution of various forms of life is one of the landmarks of intellectual history, of course. When the 100th anniversary of his birth rolled around in 1909, there were large celebrations in Cambridge, England, where he went to school, and in New Zealand, where he made some of his most important observations during the voyage of HMS Beagle in 1831, as well as in New York. But the idea of an international day of celebration only took root within the past 30 years. The first Darwin Day celebration was in 1995 in Silicon Valley, organized by Dr. Robert Stevens of the humanist community there. 2 years later, annual Darwin Day events began in Tennessee, and a program began in New Mexico in the year 2000. And today we are celebrating Darwin Day by taking a look at his life and his scientific observations, his theories, the persons and books that influenced him, some of the complications that such a radical theory has caused, and the way his experiments altered his view of the supreme being he called God. Charles Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, a market town 150 miles northwest of London, the fifth of 6 children of a wealthy society doctor and his wife. He was a grandson of abolitionists. His paternal grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, and maternal grandfather Josiah Wedgwood. Both were firm believers that slavery was an evil, and they worked to abolish it. Both his mother's and father's families were largely Unitarian, though his father, a free thinker, had him baptized in the Anglican Church. Darwin's mother died when he was 9 years old. We can only speculate on what effect that might have had on his development. He was sent to a boarding school after that. It's unclear how that might have affected his development as well, but he seems to have been a compliant child in youth. Following his father's wishes, he attended medical school at the University of Edinburgh, but he found the lectures dull, and he found surgery distressing. And he did not invest himself very deeply in his work. During this time, though, he learned taxidermy from a freed black slave named John Edmonstone, whom he called this very pleasant and intelligent man. As a sophomore, he joined a natural history group called the Plinian Society, and their debates brought him into some unfamiliar and dangerous territory for the time as they ventured into radical materialism, which Darwin found shocking at first. In the end, he neglected his medical studies, which of course annoyed his father, and who then sent him to Christ College, Cambridge, to study to become an Anglican parson. Yes, a Christian priest. Here he became a close friend of John Stevens Henslow, a professor who saw his scientific work as religious work. He called it natural theology. And Darwin himself found himself delighted by the logic of William Paley, whose book called Evidences of Christianity was very influential for him. He also studied Paley's book, Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, which made an argument for divine design in nature. You've heard of intelligent design, of course. Well, it's a very similar concept. Paley's argument, broadly stated, was that adaptation is God acting through the laws of nature. Darwin became passionately interested in natural history and observing and collecting. And when he read such books as John Herschel's, which argued that natural philosophy should seek the reasons for the laws of nature through inductive reasoning based on observation, and Alexander Humboldt's personal narrative of his scientific travels, his imagination was stimulated and his passion was stirred. He became inspired to contribute to the field and planned a trip to the tropics with some of his classmates to study, a trip which never materialized. But his friendship with his professor Hensley proved to be helpful in launching his career, though he could not have known at the time how things would have played out. Hensley's recommendation got Darwin a place on HMS Beagle, the ship that was to sail for 5 years to various exotic spots in the world, the trip that would allow Charles Darwin to closely observe the fossils and wildlife of various climes, and which would begin to get him thinking. At first, Darwin's father objected this plan as a waste of time, but he became convinced at last to fund his passage. Darwin's role was to be a companion to the captain, Robert Fitzroy. The actual naturalist on the trip was its surgeon, Robert McCormick. Stephen Jay Gould explains this strange circumstance in an essay in his book, Ever Since Darwin. But why would a British captain want to take as a companion for a 5-year trip a man he had only met on the previous month? Gould says that in the 1830s, voyages lasted for many years, with long stretches between ports and very limited contact by mail with friends and family at home. In addition to that, British naval tradition dictated that a captain have virtually no social contact with anyone else down the chain of command. He dined alone and met with his officers only to discuss ship's business and to converse in the most formal and correct manner. Fitzroy, the captain, was only 26 years old when he set sail, and he knew the psychological toll that prolonged lack of human contact could take on the captain. The Beagle's previous skipper had broken down and shot himself to death during the Southern Hemisphere winter of 1828, his 3rd year away from home. And Fitzroy was worried that he had a hereditary disposition to mental illness. In fact, Fitzroy did break down and temporarily relinquished his command during the Beagle's voyage, while Darwin was laid up with illness in Valparaiso. Fitzroy took along Darwin as a social companion, and Darwin's father bore the cost of the passage for him. Fitzroy had sent out word that he wanted a gentleman companion, a gentleman naturalist. That was explanation enough for the men on board and reason enough for Darwin to be interested. Darwin's main role was to share the table at mealtime with the captain for 5 years. His passion for observing, collection, analyzing, and making conjectures meant that he would function in a more significant way than that. Gould points out how this story illustrates the importance of social class as a consideration in the history of science. Darwin's personal riches gave him the freedom to pursue research without encumbrance. Darwin had a number of illnesses, and he was quite seasick for much of the time he was sailing. His various illnesses, Gould says, often permitted only 2 or 3 hours of fruitful work in a day. And he speculates that Darwin's social standing played a role at a turning point in his career. When Darwin embarked on his voyage on the Beagle with Captain Fitzroy, he was a naively pious student for the ministry. But his first notes concerning what he called the transmutation of species were made less than a year after his return. His studies of geology and physiology of various species challenged his worldview in a profound way. We are told from various sources that Darwin, on board the Beagle, for the first few years, was so pious that he quoted scripture to the men to lecture them on their morality, gaining him a fairly comic reputation on board. Imagine the challenge it was to him to try to justify the ways of God and the ways of nature as he followed his new calling. Gould points out that we traditionally credit Darwin's close study of the differences in speciation between various finches and tortoises as the primary impetus for his conversion from a biblical literalist to an eventual agnostic. But he suggests that Fitzroy himself might have been an even more important catalyst. Here is where the roles of power and tradition come into play. During the course of their conversations, it became clear that the captain was a martinet and an ardent Tory. Darwin was an equally committed Whig. As you might imagine, he tried hard to avoid the topic of politics, but when the topic of slavery came up, the captain told Darwin that he had witnessed proof of slavery's benevolence. One of Brazil's largest slaveholders had assembled his captives and asked them if they wished to be freed. Unanimously, they had responded no. Darwin was bold enough to wonder aloud whether the slaveholders' presence might have intimidated the slaves. Fitzroy exploded and informed Darwin that anyone who doubted his word was unfit to eat with him. So Darwin moved out and moved in with the mates. But Fitzroy backed down and sent a formal apology a few days later. Darwin, in the end, disliked Fitzroy, but he was his guest and his subordinate. A captain at sea was an absolute and unquestioned tyrant in Fitzroy's time. Darwin had to keep silent for 5 years. He sat for meals with a man with a tyrant's authority, a tyrant who later in life was consumed with the argument from design, the belief that God's benevolence can be inferred from the perfection of the organic structure. Gould speculates, think of Darwin's position on board, dining every day for 5 years with an authoritarian captain whom he could not rebuke, whose politics and bearing stood against his beliefs, and whom basically he did not like. Who knows what silent alchemy may have worked on Darwin's brain during this 5 years of insistent harangue. Darwin's growing materialistic view of the world was certainly formed in large part by his observations, but there is a psychological aspect to every person, and close relationships with persons with whom you don't agree will have an effect on your thinking in all areas, scientific as well as personal. Before Darwin ever embarked on his 5-year voyage, he was aware that horse owners, dog owners, and farmers selectively bred for certain traits, a practice called artificial selection. Knowing that allowed for the idea of a more naturalistic selection to emerge, but it had to do so against a formidable obstacle: Darwin's belief in the literal truth of the Bible. If he was to be true to his convictions as they emerged from study and analysis, something had to give. Stephen Jay Gould states the logic of the theory of evolution through natural selection this way. 1, organisms vary, and these variations are inherited, at least in part, by their offspring. 2, organisms produce more offspring than can possibly survive. 3, on average, offspring that vary most strongly in directions favored by the environment will survive and propagate. Favorable variation will therefore accumulate in populations by natural selection. Often enough, we think of the negative aspect of this, that natural selection is the executioner of the unfit. But what of the positive version of the formulation? Gould reminds us that natural selection is the creative force of evolution. Natural selection must construct the fit as well as eliminate the unfit. It must build adaptation in stages by preserving generation after generation the favorable part of a random spectrum of variation. It's this word random, I think, that causes the most problem for believers and those who want to believe that a loving God must have a plan and that the plan must have at its heart a goal that's constructive, life-affirming, and good. If you are a believer in natural selection by random variations, you will probably find yourself struggling to reconcile two ideas which seem to be irreconcilable. In his book, Finding Darwin's God, Kenneth Miller makes the case that you can be both a believer in evolution and a theist, a believer in a creator God. For most of the book, he argues against various belief systems or concepts of God that are reductive, literal, or specious. In various chapters, he attempts and succeeds, I think, in arguing against these three false visions. The first he describes as God the charlatan, a creationist viewpoint that explains fossil history as a stratagem of a creator who plants false clues in the earth to test the faith of his creatures. I've heard this argument advanced by Seventh-day Adventists of my acquaintance. The second is God the magician, in which he takes on intelligent design as it's most usually conceived. The third is God the mechanic, a vision of God that maintains that a complex system cannot be produced directly by numerous slight modifications of a system that came before. Why? Because any precursor to a complex system that's missing a part has to be non-functional by definition. In other words, if it's not perfect from the start, then God can't be involved because God is perfect. Complexity is at the core of the argument against evolution. The idea is that if a system requires all of its parts to have a useful function as they work together, there's no way for natural selection to produce it. Miller sees this in an attempt to argue for intelligent design from another angle. Yet Miller is a believer, a Christian, actually, and far from denying it was his purpose, as stated in the subtitle of his book, to present a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. He says in his final chapter, a non-believer, of course, puts his trust in science and finds no value in faith. And I certainly agree that science allows non-believer and believer alike to investigate the natural world through a common lens of observation, experiment, and theory. The ability of science to transcend cultural, political, and even religious differences is part of its genius, part of its value as a way of knowing. What science cannot do is assign either meaning or purpose to the world that it explores. What that means, he says, is that our human tendencies to assign meaning and value must transcend science and ultimately come from outside of it. The science that results then is enriched and informed from its contact with our own values and our own principles of faith. He critiques these same individuals for their theology. He says that the various objections to evolution take a narrow view to the capabilities of life, but they take an even narrower view of the capabilities of the Creator. They hobble his genius by demanding that the material of his creation ought not to be capable of generating complexity. They demean his breadth of vision by ridiculing the notion that the materials of his world have evolved into beings with intelligence and self-awareness. And here's my favorite quote. They compel him to descend from heaven onto the factory floor by conscripting labor into the design of each organism that graces the surface of our living planet. Our living planet. Our planet on which life evolves as it copes with environmental challenges. Miller goes on to say that if we can accept the day-to-day actions of living organisms as direct consequences of the molecules that make them up, like that dot story that we heard from Kelly earlier, why should it be any more difficult to see that similar principles are behind the evolution of those organisms? If the Creator uses physics and chemistry to run the universe, why wouldn't he have used physics and chemistry to produce it too? So, what about Darwin? A biblical literalist and scripture-based moralist, when he signed on to accompany Captain Fitzroy on the Beagle in 1831, His study of geological strata, the fossils found there, the variety of species developed in order to adapt to a particular location, all of these expanded his worldview of how the world works through time and informed one of the most important scientific theories of the past 200 years and challenged his theology. He had a few things to say about his belief system, but it's not clear that they are consistent. From around 1849, when his family attended church, he went for a walk instead. At the same time, he said it was absurd to doubt that a man might be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. 30 years later, in 1879, he wrote, "I have never been an atheist in denying the existence of God. I think that generally an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind." And he is quoted as saying this, "Science has nothing to do with Christ, except insofar as the habit of scientific research makes a man cautious in accepting evidence. For myself, I do not believe there has ever been any revelation. As for a future life, every man must judge for himself between conflicting, vague probabilities." What do you think? Do you believe in evolution? Do you believe in a creator God or a natural theology? Do you believe that the vital, dynamic, creative force that allows for life and change can be called God? Is your theology consistent with your understanding of the natural world? If you ask yourself these questions seriously and you answer them as clearly as you can, given whatever knowledge base you have right now, you will achieve maturity in your theology and be a blessing to those you speak with about these things. May it be so.